Okay, so um, my plan is tonight is and tomorrow. What I found in preparing the lesson on the Song of Songs was that the Torah portion, Kitisa, very much again blended into what we're studying in the Song of Songs. I don't know why that is, but even the setting we've just had of Purim in the month of Adar, we can see that the month of Adar is associated with this particular Torah portion. And the contributions are linked to that, which we won't go into that. So, what I decided to do is go ahead and develop out the lesson for tonight on the Song of Songs. And if we have time at the end, I haven't kind of looked through to see who else on here, but remember we had a challenge a few weeks back on the two pillars. We talked about the throne of glory and then the throne of judgment. And then we looked at the pillars as having also that dual function, having a pillar of glory, i.e., the cloud, and then having a pillar of judgment or fire that protected them from Pharaoh. And so I had challenged you guys if you'd like to follow up on that. And I think Kim Allen has followed up on that. And I had asked her if she has time tonight, if she'd be willing to present what she found. And so at the end of the lesson, that's what I'd like to do tonight. And then tomorrow, we're just going to continue with the Song of Songs, but I'm going to fold in the Kitisa elements that really they're just, I'm looking at the Midrash right now on the Song of Songs, and it's directly speaking to the Torah portion. How awesome is that? And who knew that we would have timed our study to fall like that? I don't know. So that's Baruch Hashem. I love it when the Spirit moves and it gives you that sense of being in sync with what the Spirit's doing. So let me share my screen with you. And more good news tonight. I received the interior design for the paperback of the Esther book. So I've got to do a page by page on that in the morning. And if it's all good, then we can get it uploaded. She's got the ISBN for the cover. She's going to get the cover formatted. And that could be up by the end of the week, the paperback version. And then the South African version should follow right on the heels of that. So we've made a lot of progress, even with all the bad weather. Made some really good progress on these projects. So let's go to lesson 21, play from current slide. And I just I wanted to review a little bit from the last lesson so we would remember which verses we're dealing with. And the verses are in Song of Songs 1, 9, and 10. And it says, "To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads." And so last week, we ended with this. We ended with the question of why in the world did the Jewish sages spend so much time discussing judgment and seals in association with this verse? It's like when you get to this verse, all the conversations just take one, a turn in one direction, and they start talking about judgment and seals. And so the question was, well, why are they associating this particular verse, which is a very beautiful verse? "To me, my darling, you are like a mare among the chariots of Pharaoh." It's very romantic. But in the commentary, as we saw, they were associating it with judgment, and specifically with the judgment on Pharaoh, because, of course, his name is mentioned in the context. And so they're relating this verse to a lesson that we should have learned at the Sea of Reeds. And they're associating it with the judgment on Pharaoh's chariots, how this divine intervention destroyed the chariots of Pharaoh. And then we went through and we looked at some strange commentary where it says, Pharaoh rode on a stallion, whereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, was revealed to him riding on a stallion, ready to battle him. Thus it is written, when you rode upon your steeds. And we'll look at the complete context of that quote from Habakkuk 3:8. And then they say, wicked Pharaoh then said, for what use to me is to ride the stallion, which kills its owner in battle. And the reason it does that is it's a little graphic, because the way that the mare and the stallion behave in battle is a little bit different. And it's for the stallion, if he has to urinate, he will stop everything else and he will urinate. When the mare needs to urinate, if she's in the heat of battle, then she doesn't stop what she's doing. Right? I told you it was graphic. And so Pharaoh is saying in battle, the mare is going to be preferable. And we looked at the reasons why, other reasons why in previous lessons. But it's basically the mare is more malleable to the needs of the rider. She's not going to stop in the middle of a full-out war just in order for the convenience of taking care of her bodily functions. She'll just go as she goes. And so Pharaoh says, I'll ride upon a mare. Or immediately Pharaoh rode upon a mare. And remember, this is allegory. All right, we don't know if this is literally true, but our interest is in the allegory because of what John said about it. Thereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, was revealed to him, to Pharaoh, riding upon a mare. Thus it is written in our verse, with my mare, to Pharaoh's chariot, I was likened for your sake, my beloved. Pharaoh then proceeded to ride on a red steed, and on a white steed, or on a black steed. And correspondingly, the Holy One, blessed is he, was revealed riding on red, white, and black steeds. Thus it is written, you have trodden the sea with your steeds. And that's Habakkuk 3:15, indicating that God appeared as though riding many steeds, corresponding to Pharaoh's steeds. And if you'll remember, there's other passages where it talks about Adonai when he rides, that he'll ride upon the clouds, or it will say that he will ride upon the cherubim, or he will ride upon, I believe it's singular, he rides upon a cherub. He rides upon this spiritual entity. So he's not literally riding on a flesh and blood horse. The flesh and blood horse is as close as a description could be for human eyes and ears, as a spiritual thing could be. But in this allegory of the different colors of horses, that then John also sees them in the book of Revelation. They say that, again, he's not literally riding a white horse, a black horse, a red horse. He's merely allowing Pharaoh to envision this so that he would think himself to be a match for God and seek to outdo him in this battle. So that the funnel of the story, sometimes that's what these allegories do. They're telling you a story, but you'll realize at the very end, you've been drawn down to this very narrow conclusion, like in a funnel. And so the moral of the story of the red, white, and black steeds is that the enemies of Israel will think to outdo Adonai himself. And whatever it is they need to see in order to be deceived into thinking that they can outdo him, outbattle him, outmatch him, outgod him, he will let them see whatever they want to see. Whatever their weakness is. Obviously, Pharaoh's weakness is horses, historically. And so through his horses, he's going to be weakened. He's going to be allowed to see something that would make him think arrogantly that he's a match for Adonai. So when we look at John's revelation of these different horses riding out with their riders, and we can tell each of them has a different mission, just like we broke those down in workbook 2. It would seem from this allegory that I don't know if John was familiar with it. I suspect he was. It's too pointed. It's just too close together to, I think, to be a coincidence. I don't really believe in coincidences. And so if John knew this, then maybe his readers also understood that what John is seeing is there's a subtext there that says, as these horses ride out, then the adversary, the beast, the serpent, the false witness, the false prophet, whatever, they will be allowed to envision whatever it is will entice them to believe that they can defeat heaven. And so that seeing those horses would be the trigger. And for the righteous who are familiar with this, they would say, oh, okay, we're now in a reed sea situation. The adversary and adversaries of the world, he is going to allow them to see whatever it is they need to see, to be lured in, to be brought into the abyss. And here's, I told you we'd read a little more of the verse there in Habakkuk from chapter 3, verses 8 and 15. It says, did the Lord rage against the rivers, or was your anger against the rivers, or was your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? You trampled on the sea with your horses, on the surge of many waters. And they say, thus, this passage in Habakkuk has to do with the crossing at the Reed Sea. But, they're not going to recognize what we have as scriptures in the book of Revelation. So if they are relating this to the crossing at the Reed Sea and the destruction of the dragon's army, then I think John's audience can anticipate the same thing. That when we see these horses ride out, that once again, the sea is going to be trodden with his steeds, indicating that God appeared as though riding many steeds corresponding to Pharaoh's steeds. And that's what we see in Revelation, is so many attributes of the dragon and the beast and the harlot. They're very close to the way that we would describe attributes of the righteous, attributes of the Holy One, even like he appears to have a fatal wound that's healed. And you say, well, he's trying to mimic Yeshua. Yeshua appeared to be dead, but in 3 days he was alive. And so in the same way we accept this miraculous resurrection of Yeshua, the world will want to accept this miraculous resurrection of the beast with this fatal head wound. So that's why it's important, especially as times get tougher, to know exactly what the word says, so that you're not deceived, that you don't fall into that category of people who will be allowed to see and believe whatever you are predisposed to see and believe. In whatever way you would ever be tempted to supersede your will over the will of the Father, you would not fall prey to that, because you would have disciplined your will to his already. When you see the horses riding out, you discern what it's all about. And you want to be on the right side of the sea when that does occur. Oh my goodness, that's what happens when you cut and paste, right? They make another comment, which goes back to what they said about when Adonai rides something. He's always riding on something that's an intangible to us, but it has to be explained in human terms for us to grasp it. And so they say another explanation for this assemblage of steeds, like Habakkuk is talking about, they say that it's just a simple metaphor for the heavenly hosts. Just say it says he rides upon a cherub in English. Um, what do we see? Um, there is a cherub that is associated with the divine chariot. So, again, this is the point where we realize in this natural world, we read parables and we think we're living the reality. And the parable is the more spiritual, intangible. But the reverse is true because the reality is found in the spirit realm. The natural realm reflects the reality of the spiritual realm, just like Moses was told, build this tabernacle exactly according to the pattern. It already existed. So, what Moses built was the parable of the spiritual. And so, if we look at a natural horse, we're looking at a parable of a spiritual creature. One reflects the other. And so we think we're living the reality, but we are only living the parable. I think Rabbi Tatz described it like anthropomorphisms. And scholars look at anthropomorphisms and they say, well, God doesn't really have a hand. We have hands. And so that's what the scripture is doing. It's just saying God's hand so that we can understand him relative to our own hand. But he doesn't really have a hand. And they say the reverse is true. That's not really true. Adonai is the one who has a hand. What we have in this natural realm is merely a parable of the truth because the truth is in his hand. He has a true hand. What we have is a reflection and a parable of that. And if that helps you kind of, balance your brain on this thing between what we see and experience in the natural realm versus these judgments that are coming out of the spiritual realm, maybe that'll help. Or maybe it'll just confuse you even more. It helped me. So now we want to look at the phrase, my darling, because that's how the mare, we'll go back. Oh, don't thunder again, please. Where did it go? Here. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Okay, now we want to break down the darling. I got past it before it thundered. My darling in Hebrew is rayiti. And you will see this expression, I want to say around 9 times in the Song of Songs in its feminine form. Raya is going to be the feminine, Raya is going to be the masculine. In terms of using the possessive feminine, rayiti, as far as I know, it's isolated to the book of the Song of Songs. I could be wrong on that, but I think I'm right on that. In other places, you'll see Raya, and it might be translated as friend. It might be translated as neighbor. It might be translated as a companion. But anywhere else other than Song of Songs, you're probably going to see it in the masculine, and it's going to be inclusive. In other words, it could even be talking about a mixed group of people, male and female, because in Hebrew, if you have a not mixed gender, this gender stuff has got my head messed up right now. If you have a group of people of both genders, then it reverts to the masculine. Okay? English is a little bit different, but in Hebrew, it will revert to the masculine when there's males and females in one group. So where you see this particular form in other books, you will see it, it might be singular, masculine, referring to your neighbor in general, like all your neighbors, but one neighbor, like deer, it's singular and plural. But I wanted to give you an example of how it's used in other places because it's going to guide our thinking about my darling and Song of Songs because it comes from the heart of the Torah. It's in Leviticus 19:18. It says, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." All right, so that word there, neighbor, is going to be Strong's 7453, the rayah, singular. But see how the singular is being used to describe the whole group, singular masculine. In our study, we're looking at rayiti, my darling, feminine. But if we can understand the masculine form of it, then we can understand the feminine form of it. Because in the Song of Songs, we have this poetic going back and forth between the bride and his beloved. I mean, the bride and the groom and his beloved. So we've got rayah and we've got raya. We've got masculine and feminine neighbor. In Song of Songs, it's feminine. Everywhere else, it's going to be masculine. It's going to be inclusive. And they're both going to be derived from Strong's 7462. Remember, we're talking about nouns here. We're talking about people. Now let's look at the verb form. The verb form is ra'ah. And I've got the Strong's entry on there so you could take a look at it. I didn't put the whole entry, but there's enough here to give you a context. When we're thinking of our neighbor, remember when Yeshua was challenged by somebody, he says, "Who's my neighbor?" And then Yeshua tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And so at the end of the story of the Good Samaritan, he says, okay, which one was the neighbor? And so he says, well, it's the one who did good to him, which is kind of the reverse of what you would have thought in that parable. You would have thought that he's talking about maybe the reverse is that the way the parable comes out, it's the Samaritan who is in a sense tending to the other man, his neighbor. So, ra'ah, what does it mean? It means to tend a flock, to pasture it, by extension, to associate with as a friend. And then it gives some other definitions: a companion, to keep company with, to feed, uses a friend, make friendship with. Again, it goes back to the pasturing, the pasturing as well. A shepherd. It's most commonly associated with shepherding. And so it takes it back into the Jacenius, which also says to feed a flock, to pasture or to tend, to guard over, to care for. And that's exactly what we see the Good Samaritan doing. You know, he says, well, who's my neighbor? Well, it's now we understand who the shepherd is. The shepherd is the one who sees a need and guards over it and cares for that need. So, in a nutshell, if we talk about our neighbor, it's pointing us back to shepherding. And that's why shepherds are such a big deal in Scripture. In fact, the Holy One himself is called the great shepherd of the sheep because he guards for and cares for us. He pastures us. He tends to us. So if we go back to the heart of the Torah where it says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, it's saying you need to tend to your neighbor. You need to guard your neighbor. You need to care for your neighbor as yourself. In other words, be responsible for one another. And I'm going to give you an example here. And I don't know if we'll get into the Torah example until tomorrow. But remember when King David called a census? And he wasn't supposed to. King David's the one who's singing these big long songs about how I love your Torah, I meditate on it day and night. Well, if he did, then he had to have at some point meditated on the part in the Torah that says that you don't take a direct census. You don't count heads, literally. You take the half shekel. There's a buffer between you and the counting because something bad's going to happen. If you just count heads, that's not the way it's supposed to be done. And so in place of, each man in the census would bring the half shekel. And then they would take all the half shekels and count those, and that's how they came up with a number. They were never supposed to directly number Israel. So King David calls a census, and I think it was Joab, his captain, his trusted captain, tries to, like he knows he's not supposed to do it. Well, King David's the king. He ends up doing it anyway. He takes the census and counts heads. And we know what happened. He's like, David, you know you shouldn't have done this. And so you pick the punishment. And he ends up having a plague. And the plague kills so many thousands of people. And my question always was, well, if it was King David's mistake, why did the people have to suffer for it? And as I was reading through some of the background of this today in terms of shepherding and tending and guarding and caring over one another, and how it really flows also out of this week's Torah portion, Ki Tisa, we've got the sin of the golden calf, and you don't hear much objection to the golden calf. They all heard the same thing. At Mount Sinai, every single set of ears heard the exact same instructions. And they only had to remember 10. That's all they had to remember, 10, the big 10. So in under 40 days, they managed to misremember the big 10. And they end up doing exactly what they were told not to, which is to make an image in order to worship it. And we'll look at this tomorrow. Like, what were the consequences here? People are going to be killed. People are going to suffer. They're going to die because of this sin. And that was my question. If it was David's mistake, then why did the average everyday Israelite have to die and King David didn't? Well, one of the points that was brought up does kind of go back to Mount Sinai. The Israelites know the Torah. They know exactly what it says. They know exactly what is in this Torah portion about the lifting up of the head. They knew that it was improper to directly count heads in a census. And out of all the thousands or probably millions of people in the nation of Israel at that time, in a unified kingdom, did no one speak up? And that's the implication here of ra'ah, or shepherding, is you have to help your neighbor. You have an obligation to help your neighbor. If you've both heard the same information and you see your neighbor about to be overtaken in a sin, then it's your obligation to speak up, to tend to him, to look after him, to guard over him. That's one of the things about shepherding, is you don't watch another sheep walk over a cliff. And so that, they said, they start, I think it was said, with the tribe of Gad, which is the soldiers. And they go through every single tribe, and it's like, Is nobody going to stand up and say this is wrong? You have to say it's wrong. Even if he is the king, you have to say it's wrong. And there just weren't enough voices that were speaking up that could stop the process. And maybe the ones that were killed, I don't know that we're told that, but those who were killed in the plague, it may be that these were specifically people who really did have no objection. Do it any way you want to. I don't care. There may have been people who were counted who had reservations, like, I don't know about this. I don't think this is right. But they just didn't have enough courage to speak up. We don't know. The rain falls on the just and the unjust. And sometimes the plague falls on the righteous and the sinner. We don't know that. But it was something else to consider in that situation that does relate directly to our Torah portion. Is that we are responsible for one another. We can see this trait in Rebecca. Remember when Abraham's servant prays and says, okay, here's what I'm looking for in a woman. If I walk up and she offers to get water for me and my camels, I know she's the one. I know that she's a shepherdess. I know that she's got good genes. She's got good spiritual genes. She's going to know what it means to tend and to guard and to look after the welfare of others as much as the welfare of herself. And so that's where we can see that raya is the verb form of ro'eh, the shepherd, or ro'ah, the shepherdess. But it also has a homonym. And if you'll notice, sometimes in Hebrew, you will have sound-alike words that really have an almost equivalent meaning or a very similar meaning. Or sometimes they'll interchange maybe an aleph and an ayin. A real guttural throat sound in ancient times. So they would have sounded almost identical. In this case, it does have a homonym, which is ra'ah. So we've got ra'ah, which is to shepherd or to guard over, to tend. And then we have ra'ah, which means to see. Like we had a place where it says, I'm going to name this Adonai Ro'i, the God who sees me, the one who saw to me in a bad situation, the one who guarded over me, tended me, cared for me. And so in that case, they do have a shared significance to one another. So when we say love your neighbor as yourself, it's to have that shepherdess or shepherd mentality, the Good Samaritan mentality. I see the need and I'm going to tend to it. I'm going to take that obligation upon myself. And so rayiti and the Song of Songs, where it's translated my darling, it can also be translated as my shepherd. And that should have you sitting up a little straighter saying, now, wait a minute. God doesn't need a shepherd. He may not need one, but does he desire one? He's described as the great shepherd of the sheep. He doesn't live in a house. He doesn't eat food. He's not like we are. But remember, if he's the reality and we're the parable, then there is an attribute there where he cares for us. Is there something we can do that shows that we also care for him? The great shepherd cares for us, but can we also have that shepherding quality of rayiti, my darling, which demonstrates that the darling is demonstrating that she also cares. It's a mutual relationship. So it's telling us that raya in rayiti shows a mature relationship of caring for one another. It's not a one-way street. It's not a knock on heaven. This is what I want today. Thank you very much. See you at 3:00. Hello, me again. Here's my prayer. Here's what I need. Love you. Bye. See you this evening. Well, that's pretty one way. But if we think of rayiti, my darling, as my shepherd, then it's inviting us into another dimension in our relationship with the Holy One. We know that He already cares for our every need. But what if He needed something from us? Not that He would die without it, He wouldn't, but we know He has a soul. Scripture tells us He does. A soul is appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. Now remember, He is a spiritual being. So how His soul is satisfied will be similar to, but never identical to, the way that a human being, which is a created creature, could satisfy appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. But who we are is like a mirror. It's based on that pattern. We're the parable of the pattern. And so it's possible that He created us because there is something He would like to have from us. That rather than just being the store shelf, the librarian, whatever it is we're asking Him to be for us today, that He becomes more than that. That He becomes a companion. Like Abraham, he's called a friend of God. What if rayiti suggests that she's more than just the taker in the relationship, that she has become a companion and friend of her beloved? And one way she's doing that is the same way married people do it. When you first get married, hopefully you didn't live together for 16 years first, but if you did, He can make it new and fresh. But ideally, the first years of a marriage are there for you to learn what pleases your spouse. Just like with an Israelite male, he couldn't even go to war for a year because it was his job to stay home and cheer up his wife. And if you're going to cheer her up, you better find out what pleases her and what displeases her. It's raising the young man's awareness of his beloved, of his darling. And so, in the same way, if we are the rayiti to the great shepherd of the sheep, then we can also have this shepherd-like behavior of becoming aware of what the Father needs from us. He wants part of our relationship not to be based on what He gives or doesn't give. He wants it to be true companionship, for us to simply enjoy His presence, just to sit at His feet sometime and know that He's there, to offer Him our obedience, because we get in the scripture, we say, oh, this is what my beloved likes. Let me provide this for him. If I obey Him in this matter, it will please Him. And that's a much richer relationship than just, Him signing the check and handing it over each prayer session, or not. You may quit, fulfilling requests. We don't know. But I think He very much desires to have that rayiti relationship with us, where the attitude of a shepherd can arise in us, and we ask ourselves, what can I do that would please my Father? What can I do that would please my beloved? And I think this is why they're calling the sacrifices a sweet smelling aroma, because He doesn't have a nose like we do. He has a real nose. We just have a parable of a nose. But to Him, the odor of obedience, that's what brings Him pleasure. And that's our opportunity to be the rayiti, to be the shepherd, responsive in that relationship. And we can see that in the first century, people were aware of this. This was not news. They understood how the sacrificial system was a step toward that relationship. Of course, a Jewish scribe, is one who does transcribe the scriptures. So they're very intimately acquainted with the letter of the law. You couldn't get anything through a scribe that was not written. And sometimes they would make commentary based on a lifetime of transcribing those words. And the more you would transcribe them, the more you would contemplate them, the more intimate you would become with those words. And often they had great insights into the words. And we can see in this case, a scribe did have awesome insight into the word. And this is from Mark 12:28. It says, one of the scribes came and heard them arguing, and recognizing that he had answered them well, asked him, what commandment is the foremost of all? Yeshua answered, the foremost is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Well, he's just described the rayiti relationship right there. It's a love relationship. There's no give me this, give me that aspect of what he just said, and talking about the Shema as the greatest commandment. There's the rayiti element there with the Holy One, to love him with every part of you, not just the shallow part of you that wants stuff. With all of you, love him. And then he says, the second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, neighbor there, remember, is rayah. In the same way that the Shema calls you to be rayiti to the Holy One, the second one is just like it. If you're going to be rayah to him, then you also must be a rayah, a neighbor. A neighbor is going to be one who tends to others in the flock. It's going to be one who guards, who nurtures others. The neighbor is going to be the Israelite who would stand up and say, this golden calf is wrong. The neighbor is the one who says, I'm not leaving this man here on the Jericho road to die alone in pain and agony. I'm going to take care of him. The neighbor is the one who looks around and takes the initiative to express love in that shepherding way. He says there's no other commandment greater than these. The scribe said to him, right, teacher, you have truly stated that he is one, and there is no one else besides him. And to love him with all the heart and with all the understanding and with all the strength, and to love one's neighbor as himself is much more than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. So the scribe gets it. He sees that, yes, we have a system of burnt offerings and sacrifices. We do have a temple system here, but this scribe understands that being the neighbor, being the rayah, taking that relationship of rayah to your human neighbor will enable you to take that relationship with the Father to the level of rayiti. He'll call you my darling. It'll be that sort of relationship. If you can shepherd, nurture, care for, guard those in your flock and be concerned with their well-being, then you're already on track with the first one. So I wonder how much time I've got, because I'd really like to hear from Kim if she's on here. When we look at, let's do that. I'm just going to take a peek here. Kim, are you on here tonight? Okay, oh, it's here. We'll go back then and we'll finish this up. Because I was afraid I had too much to start a new topic, but we can do this. Okay. The tamid, which, remember, it was a perpetual offering. It was also the olah offering, or the whole burnt offering, which I'm not sure why they translated it whole burnt offering. That's what you do with it. But what it is a going up offering. It comes from Allah. And it's kind of a little hint word to resurrection. It means a going up offering. So what it does is it connects the darling, rayiti, of Israel to their re'ah, their neighbor in heaven. And this particular offering was always a lamb. And I think that's going to help us add another dimension to Yeshua's service. Because so many times, especially if you have to deal with an anti-missionary, which I hope you never do, but if you did, this would probably be brought up. John 1:29, of course, John the Baptist is baptizing and he sees Yeshua. It says the next day he, John, saw Yeshua coming to him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." All right, so we've always associated that in Christianity probably with the Passover offering. And there is a relationship because Yeshua described himself that way, especially there at the end, celebrating the Passover, that, as it approached with his disciples. But there's another dimension to this. We're talking about this relationship of rayiti, of shepherding one another, taking obligation for one another when we don't have to. It's volunteer service, basically. We could get by with less, in other words, in that particular relationship. But if we want to enjoy the full relationship of rayiti, then there has to be a way of drawing nearer and taking more obligation. Yeshua is going to be a great example of this. He even prays, even up to the end. He says, "If possible, let this cup pass from me." Because he didn't want to do it. He nevertheless took the obligation for something that he was not obligated to do. He just volunteered to do it. He agreed to do it. And so in that, we can see that he enjoyed a relationship with the Father. What was it before? We don't know exactly. But what it was afterward was very close. They're one. And so we have this place of drawing near with the sacrifices and the burnt offerings. But like the scribe and Yeshua said, there's something greater than that. And that's the shepherd mentality. It's the rayiti mentality. And so we have an opportunity, even with that burnt sacrifice in place. Even at that time in the first century, when there was a functioning temple, people understood that there was something closer and better than that, something called a relationship. And so in Yeshua, we can experience an even better relationship than what we experience through the burnt offerings. Because if we had this tamid, this olah offering that was always a lamb, then that adds an extra layer of what John is saying. And once I show you what they believed about this tamid lamb, we already know what we know about the Passover lamb, but let's look at the tamid lamb. And maybe what John's saying makes better sense in terms of the relationship that it builds between shepherd, the great shepherd, and the shepherds, our neighbor, and then our beloved, and then we become the rayiti. And so these two tamid offerings, they're hinting to the work of the lamb, because they had to be a lamb. He's called the lamb that was slain. Is that only the Passover offering, or could it also be talking about the tamid offering? Because it never ceased. It went on evening and morning, day to day in the temple, no matter what, until the temple was destroyed. In fact, when they could no longer obtain the lambs for the temple sacrifices, that's when they knew that Rome had already destroyed the city. They just hadn't come through the walls yet. But when they could no longer offer the lamb, it was over. So the Song of Songs, the Midrash on it, is offering us an insight into rayiti. Remember, they said they interpret that as my shepherd, or the one who sustains me. And so they're offering this look here at Israel as she who sustains me, me being the Holy One. A nation who can mature into a great relationship with the great shepherd. And that relationship is one of mutual love and care. She pays attention to what he needs and wants. And she offers her obedience to him. It is, like the scribe said, it is deeper than just a dead animal. So in Numbers 28:4, it says, the one lamb shall you make in the morning, and the second lamb shall you make in the afternoon. That was the two lambs of the daily offering. But if you look at it, there was only one purpose. And there is a tradition within Judaism of two messiahs. One is the suffering servant, Mashiach ben Yosef, and then one is the conquering king, Mashiach ben David. So we got two lambs here, but they only have one purpose. And that purpose, they said, was to sustain the relationship between the raya above and the raya below. So this perpetual smoke of the tamid offering was there to connect two realms, just like the incense offering on the golden altar. It says that of the morning was offered to atone for the sins committed during the night, and that of the afternoon was offered to atone for the sins committed during the day. As such, no person spent the night in Jerusalem in possession of a sin. As it is stated, righteousness lodged in her. From Isaiah 121. Now, that on its face, you're going, that doesn't exactly sound right, because I know they sinned, and they did. However, even though it can't be literally true, because we know Jerusalem was destroyed for sin, source after source we look in the Jewish tradition, those sages from ancient times until today, they attribute these falls of Jerusalem, the temples, to unreasonable hatred among brothers. Even the first temple, where you had the idolatry. Well, the context of the idolatry goes back to the splitting of the kingdom into the southern and the northern kingdoms. Jeroboam institutes an alternate altar, an idolatrous altar, And that act went hand in hand with the separation of the northern and the southern tribes into separate kingdoms. So the idolatry was just a symptom that there was no darling relationship among brothers and sisters. And so when they approach Solomon's son, Rehoboam, the northern tribes, and they say, could you please lighten our workload? This has been very hard on us. We've been put to forced labor. Could you lighten the load? Instead, he says, no, I'm going to make it harder. Well, there's no neighbor relationship in that. There's no nurturing care. There's no shepherding in that. There's only domination. And that's not the relationship that neighbors have. It's not about dominance. It's a darling relationship. It's a rayiti relationship. It's taking obligation for one another's well-being relationship. And so taking advantage of that, knowing that the brothers and sisters of Israel are called to Jerusalem to worship at the Moedim, at the foot festivals, and not to treat them as a good shepherd, as a shepherd king. That was a failure on the part of Rehoboam. It's also a failure on the part of Jeroboam, because now he is going to deprive his kingdom of the ability to go to Jerusalem and worship. Neither one of them understands rayiti. What they're doing is separating brothers, the seventh abomination. Whereas they should be working to achieve companionship and shepherding one another. Somebody pointing out, hey, that's not okay. We don't seem to find that. So, just for discussion, and we can, if you want to do it here, you can do it. Or if you just want to take this away for the week to work on and think about bringing up the Tamid lamb, that Yeshua could have possibly, that John was possibly seeing him as more than a Passover lamb, but that he was seeing him as part of the Tamid, the two lambs every day, that in their view, it took away the sins of Jerusalem. Now, maybe while it didn't at that time, sin did occur. Could they also be seeing into the future? Could they see a time when Jerusalem was being gathered under the Messiah? And of course, not recognizing Yeshua as the Messiah, you get more information in the letter to the Hebrews about this aspect of Yeshua, more in the context of Yom Kippur, but I think it might have elements of this too. I mean, I don't have it already in my head all formed out. That's why I wanted to throw it out there for you guys to work on as a discussion question. Because John says pretty much what the Tamid lambs did for Jerusalem, according to tradition, taking away anybody who went up to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast, that these Tamid lambs took away their sins morning and evening. What did John mean when he says Yeshua is going to be able to do this for the world with his sacrifice? He is going to be a lamb that can take away the sin of the world. How? My question is, how exactly would that work? Like I said, I don't have the answer already, but I thought I'd give you guys something to think about.